So Kamran Pasha is a Hollywood screenwriter. He's a novelist and he's also a producer. He's best known for his work on television series such as Sleeper Cell in Kings and many more. He brings a distinctive perspective to storytelling, drawing from his background as a journalist, a lawyer, a student of religion and history. Beyond television, however, Kamran is the author of historical novels such as Mother of the Believers and Shadow of the Swords. He is recognized for weaving together themes of faith, politics, and human drama into narratives that resonate with many. So, welcome to this podcast interview, Kamran.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. It's good to
Wa
be on
alaikum
here.
assalam. Awesome. So, you've been writing for about 15 years or so.
No, I ran more
I'm-
than that. I've been working professionally in Hollywood for it'll be 24. I joined the Writers Guild 24 years ago this past April. So yeah, since 2001.
Awesome. So I think you have a very unique perspective in terms of writing. Would you be able to give us a walkthrough of your typical writing day? What does your process look like from the moment you sit down at the desk?
Well, most of the day is spent in procrastination and panic. I think any professional writer does that. That's part of the process where your terror sets in and you think I can't write and it won't come this time because, one of the things that any artist discovers is that they don't actually control this process. The idea that of the muse of something whispering within you, even, there were Muslim scholars that say jinn can whisper things into you, art, and a lot of art comes from that, and that's true. It's absolutely true. I'm not saying it's an evil jinn, but it is a spirit, and you don't control it, and and it's terrifying because once you do this professionally, this is your source of income. You're relying your entire whether you can put food on your table to keep your home is based on something you can't control. So most of it is done as procrastination, which is out of fear of it not coming. But what happens is the only way the procrastination is defeated and the voice of that muse or that jinn or whatever it is activated is when you sit down to do the work. The moment you actually sit down in front of the computer or whatever art you are, if you're a sculptor, if you're taking whatever your medium is and you're sculpting it, the moment you begin the work, instantly it turns on. And then that takes over, and that's the frightening part is trusting that that's going to happen every single time. So my writing moment begins when I sit down and write, and then at its best, you go into a trance and you don't remember what you're doing. And I mean, I look back, like you mentioned, my novels, I'll read them again, and I don't remember writing any of it. I remember being there and typing, but the words are new to me. It's like, wow, that's a pretty nice turn of phrase. Who came up with that? Because I don't remember doing it. So that's the kind of zone that you get into as an artist. Hopefully, because that's when hopefully it's good. I mean, the times that I can remember writing stuff, it's always bad, right? Because that's my conscious mind creating, and your conscious mind isn't what's creating. It's you're channeling something greater than yourself. Your conscious ego is much smaller. And so when your conscious mind is making things, it's not good.
Awesome. So I think you also have a unique perspective regarding outlining screenplay. What do you actually do before diving into dialogue and scenes?
Well, I mean, I developed my own method. I'm self-trained. I mean, I went to film school after I had sold 2 scripts and had gotten into the Writers Guild, was a professional working writer. Then I used those those accomplishments to apply to UCLA Film School because I wanted to get in there, and I did. I completed UCLA Film School, and I have an MFA degree. But I'd already been a working professional screenwriter, and I created my own method because I don't know how to do it. So I was working full time as a lawyer while I was writing these scripts as a hobby. The method that I developed was purely how my brain works, and I discovered that nobody really does it this way, and yet it works very effectively. I mean, you have, and I've worked together. I've served a little bit of a mentor to you at times on some of your writing, so you have a sense of. I think I've even shared with you my actual process in written form in my essay on how I do it, because I taught at Penn State University a couple of years ago, and that was the essay I gave my students as my method. But in synopsis, what it is I look at bookends of a story, the beginning, the end, and then the middle, because the fundamental problem, if you want to make a good story that's commercially viable or that most people will be attracted to, it has to follow certain twists and turns that the human mind is familiar with. And the best way to understand that generally is actually go back to Aristotle. If you read Aristotle's On Poetics, which you can buy that today in English translation, where it's a short, simple book on the nature of drama, and it talks about the three act structure. So as far as I'm aware, it's the first time anyone put into you know uh, written form, the idea of the three act structure was Aristotle, and it still works. So that's the broad form of the three act structure of a story, beginning, middle, and end. But what I did, the twist I have on it is I go beginning, end, middle. So I always, everything I do, I imagine the opening of the project, whether it's a novel or it's a script, I always think of it as a movie. And so I imagine what's the opening scene that hooks me in, that makes me want to watch this movie, right? And then I jump to the very end. What's the conclusion? What's the conclusion? How does this end? Hopefully, in some kind of heart stirring or emotionally impactful manner that ties it all together. And then when I know what that is, I go, well, how would the logically, if it began here and ended here, what would be the logical middle point of the story? That was the turning point that made us get from point A to point Z. And that's the midpoint. And then that is how I structure the story. And I keep doing those uh, sequentially. So once I have the midpoint, I'll look at, well, what's the opening scene of the midpoint? Well, what's the turning point between that? So that's going to be somewhere in between there. And so I do that process over and over, and I write the script in this fashion. It feels like a jigsaw puzzle, but what happens is once you do this, I just trained a professional screenwriter who asked me for help on their screenplay. I sat down with her a week ago, and this is a professional screenwriter, represented one of the biggest agencies in Hollywood, right? And she sat down and said she was having difficulty with it. I said, okay, let's go. I'll show you my method. Within 1 hour, we had restructured an entire script. Within 1 hour. I mean, and every one of my stories, usually within 1 hour, using this method, I know every single scene of the movie or the novel, because this method forces you to stay contained. One of the biggest dangers, especially for writers, especially is that they don't writers can go off half cocked in other directions. They can suddenly fall in love with this character and take it in some weird place and forget the overall thread of the story, and then they're left with a script that doesn't work or novel that is dysfunctional. Many writers fall into this trap. It's because they don't think in structural terms. My belief is that once you understand the structure of a story, like Aristotle explained, once you understand that, that forces you to do good writing because it limits your options. One of the things that we know of in art is that limitations create art. So, when Islam expanded and the Muslims conquered the Middle East and the Iranian empires and the Byzantine empires, they absorbed the artists of these cultures. They became Muslim, and and so you had great artists in these cultures, right? But then certainly in the early days, first several centuries of Islam, there was a very strong feeling that any kind of pictorial display could lead to idolatry. I think more Muslims are relaxed on that nowadays, right? There's Muslim comic books and whatever. But in the early days, there was a lot of fear that any kind of imagery of living things could lead to shirk, could lead to idolatry. And so a lot of Islamic scholars put a very strict thing on in the first couple of centuries of Islam of we can't show it, you can't do drawings of animals or human beings. So what do artists do? They have a very extreme restriction placed upon them that has not been placed upon them before in most other cultures, right? So what did Muslim artists do? They adapted under the limitation and focused on geometry, calligraphy, and floral forms, and mastered those techniques. So because of that limitation that you could think, oh, artists are going to resent this, they can't draw a human being or an animal because it might be an idol, you create the Taj Mahal. You create the most incredible works of art in human history because that limitation forced us to turn the art in another direction and master something else, and we did.
Awesome. So we've spoken a little bit about history, what with the Taj Mahal and everything. I was curious, how do you actually balance historical accuracy with dramatic storytelling in your scripts?
Well, I mean, all of my series, because alhamdulillah, I've got two novels published, and one of them I had to be very, very careful, especially on the historical accuracy, because first novel is published in Mother of the Believers, and that novel is the story of Sayyidina Aisha radiallahu anha. It's the novel of the birth of Islam from her point of view. It's a fictional novel, but you can imagine the Muslims were already going to, be upset that I was even writing a novel in this topic, right? And so I had to stick very closely to the known Islamic seerah, and so if you read my novel, the opening thing is an author's note that lists all my Islamic sources of the original biographies, Asidas going back to the 8th and 9th centuries, or Ibn Kathir's, commentary on the Quran, all of these things. So I was like, because I knew the Muslims would attack me, and so I had to be as historically accurate as possible. So within that framework, for example, and actually Aisha radiallahu anha made it easy for us in some ways because because she narrated over 10,000 hadith, right? And she gave us so much incredible knowledge, especially about her private life with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Literally everything, how he drank, how he ate, how he went to the bathroom, everything was very clear. Like we know more about him than any other human being in history because of her primarily, because she was there. She's his wife and how did he brush his teeth, right? I mean, we know everything, right? Because of how did he tie his shoes, because she reported all of it. And she also reported a lot of her emotional, psychological things because, she's a very complicated human being. One of the reasons I wrote the novel about her is that, she's a complex person. The Prophet ﷺ loved her above all with all of her human flaws, right? That's why she's interesting to me. But she relayed a lot of her emotional feelings and complexities and anger and being upset about this. She relayed all of that. So it was very easy for me to craft the novel because if anyone says, Astaghfirullah, how could you say she thought that? I was like, I'm just quoting what she said. I'm just quoting what she said, right? So in that one, I had to be very strict. I mean, there is poetic license because, you know, there are things where we don't have the answer to how she felt or what other people were thinking in that moment. We can guess based on the sources, and we can guess based on opinions, right? And within the different Muslim groups, Sunnis and Shia will look at the same historical event and ascribe different motivations to the people, right? And so what do you and so what do you do, right? So I had to create a thread of making sense of these people based on my opinion, having, I mean, I have my beliefs. I'm a Sunni Muslim. I'm also part of the Sufi Tariqa, and so I have opinions, right? And I had to make sense of what all these Sahaba did, and I went with one principle that I had to accept that they were all sincere, right? At least when they became Muslims, because before they were Muslims, they were doing all kinds of stuff, right? When they became Muslim, they were sincere and doing the best they could. Doesn't mean they didn't make mistakes. Doesn't mean they weren't wrong about things. Because the Sira shows that, right? And they fought. They had a civil war. So obviously somebody was wrong in that, right? Can't have both sides be right in a war, right? And so I had to thread together what their motivations were. But so that brought, and so that helped me with my other stuff because that novel, people that read it, the vast majority say, and the vast majority of Muslims who read it say that it feels very authentic to them. And that's how I approach it, is that in historical novel telling, you want to stick as much as possible to the historical events, uh, you know, but where I think the fun and the flexibility of being a writer is to look inside the minds of the characters and try to understand what motivates them, right? Because we don't always know. And some people are unpredictable. They do things that don't make sense. They do things that don't make sense to historians. And so people argue about it. Why do they do this? Because human beings are very, we have motivations we don't always understand. The historical record doesn't always reveal everything about why people were doing things, right? So you have to make sense of it. So that's a challenge, but that's what I enjoy, is that for me, what I like writing are people like us. They're flawed human characters, right? And the great thing about Islam is that this was all in the Sira. We didn't have Muslims were colonized by the British, and so the British for a while imposed their Victorian values on us, and they tried to re-engineer Islam to be like English Christianity, right? And with saints and idealizations, and so there was the period where Muslims became very uncomfortable looking at the Islamic histories because they don't idealize these people. They showed them as human beings who did great things, who did not so great things, even while they acted with faith, right? They did the best they could. And then you realize, well, I'm not as good as them, but if I had been thrown in that situation, I probably would have made a worse decision than they did, right? Once you see the full context of everything. So that's why I love Islamic history so much, is that these people are real people. They're flawed because only Allah is perfect, right? And that's the only way you can know righteousness, is if you have somebody who is filled with anger in a situation, but then controls it. There's righteousness in that. But someone who doesn't feel anger at all, you can't identify with that person. It's not real.
Awesome. So you've touched on it a little bit, but I'm curious to know, what role does research actually play in your process? Especially working on period pieces. They don't necessarily have to be religious in nature, but I'm talking about projects set in specific cultures or
Sure.
countries, perhaps.
Well, I mean, for me, when I research, I try to learn as much as possible about the historical period. For example, I have the first movie I sold to a studio was the love story of the Taj Mahal to Warner Brothers. It sits there in the library. One day I'll make it, inshallah. It's for 20 years and it still hasn't been made. Every year, some producer comes, "That's the best script I've ever read," and why hasn't it been made yet? I don't know. So, but what when reading the history of, because it's the story of Shah Jahan and Mumtaz Mahal and the building of the Taj, and Noor Jahan is the adversary of the queen, and incredible people, right? And but I'm reading their histories, I read them looking for quote unquote filmic moments. That's the way I approach things. Even as thinking of it as a novel, I read them and going, what would make a great scene? What's exciting, right? And in great historical events, there's a lot of them, right? And you can you can understand, because I think of beginning, end, and middle, right? So we know how something began, we know how it ended, and then we can figure out what were the events that led to the middle, right? And so when I approach it from that point of view, I'm then able to single out the pivotal historical events that will make the story work. You can't do every single thing, but you have to, if because the structure that I'm doing forces me to make choices, right? If my Taj Mahal, for example, my Taj Mahal script is a flashback structure. It starts off with Shah Jahan in prison, overthrown by his son Aurangzeb, and and he's telling the story of what happened to him in the building of the Taj Mahal. The Taj Mahal is completed, and we can see it through the window of his cell in the Red Fort, right? And as he's looking at the Taj Mahal, he tells a story. So the beginning is the flashbacks to when he was a young man. He first meets, Arjuman Bano, who would become Empress Mumtaz, right? And the end is where he's going to end up in this prison cell, right? So the midpoint, of course, I figured out, well, had to be the moment where he was, because he wasn't originally destined to be the emperor. His older brother was, right, but his older brother rebelled against Jahangir and failed, and Jahangir actually horrifically blinded his own son, blinded him, right? And so then Khurram, who would become Shah Jahan, who was not the first son, he wasn't meant to be the emperor, was then elevated. So then I knew that, okay, well, the event that's going to turn him from the young prince who just wants to marry the beautiful princess and live a normal life is suddenly thrust into power that he doesn't want, will be the midpoint, right? So I mean, the structures then force themselves, right? And so looking at those events, I was able to pick and choose how it would work within the structure to make the structure work, and the events were all there.
Awesome. Would it be fair to say that you're inspired by history? In your opinion, what core themes or questions drive your body of work?
Well, for me, what human beings have actually done is more interesting than anything you could make up. What human beings have done is unbelievable. I mean, no work of fiction comes close to what human beings have actually done, because what human beings have actually done is so improbable. The people involved are so random. They do amazing things. They do ridiculous things, and you can't predict any of it. And that's how history flows, right? So if your best fiction can't mimic the craziness of how events happened, right? And so that's what interests me. Trying to capture the magic of that. I also think that we especially right now live in a time where history is forgotten, perhaps almost intentionally, that maybe the powers that be don't want us to remember the past because, they like us to be ignorant, because once you know the past, you can predict the future, and, they don't like us to be able to do that. You so I think people generally don't know much about history. For example, Islamic history has been erased. It's been completely erased. The colonialists did that. They did that on purpose. And I did a project on Islamic Spain, a TV series set in Al-Andalus. And one of the things I discovered in my research was that the way that Spain was Catholicized, was Christianized, as Spain was majority Muslim for 800 years, right? So it wasn't an occupation; it was a Muslim country, like in the way Morocco was a Muslim country. So when Granada fell in 1492, and Spaniards took control of Islamic Spain once and for all, they discovered they couldn't drive Islam out. They forced everyone to convert to Catholicism publicly, but privately, the Muslims were still doing salah at home, right? They were practicing publicly. They pretended to be Catholic, so they'd be left alone. They wouldn't be tortured by the Inquisition, right? But privately, they kept their Islam. And so the Catholics were so frustrated, and they realized that there was no way to erase Islam from Spanish identity, because what Islam was Spanish identity. There was no way to do it. So what they did was they then took over the Muslim schools, the schooling systems, and they then intentionally erased Islamic history from the students, especially in Andalusia and in the southern part of Spain. So the kids would go to school and would not be told anything about their ancestors. They would not be told about, they would look at the beautiful building of the Alhambra and not be told of anything about its history. right? To this day, that works, and that worked. That eradicated Islam for centuries out of Spain because the ignorance, because history was erased. So when I went to do research in Spain itself, when I went to Granada, my taxi driver was driving me, and he was telling me that his family could trace themselves back to the days of the Moors, to the days of the 1300s in Granada. They've been in Granada since the 1300s. So I asked him about some of the history. He knew nothing. He knew nothing. He knew nothing about how the Moors came. He knew nothing about how they fell because they weren't teaching. To this day, they're not teaching it, right? Because this guy might remember that he's Muslim, right? So that's why I do these historical things, especially Muslim historical projects, because this was adopted by the British and the French colonists as well. They studied the Inquisition. They studied how Spain was de-Islamicized. So that's what they wanted to do in the Muslim world. So when the British and the French took over Muslim schools throughout the Middle East and in India, they went out of their way to remove Islamic history from people's minds, and which also allowed various fundamentalists and other groups with a false understanding of Islamic history to come in and fill that gap with bad ideas because they didn't know Islamic history, right? They didn't know the traditional scholars. They didn't know Imam Ghazali. So some crazy guy from Saudi Arabia shows up, tells them what Islamist scholar says. They don't have any knowledge base to counter it, right? And so why I'm doing in particular these historical projects, and I've done things that have nothing to do with Islam. I'll talk about them a little bit. I'm working on a project about Marilyn Monroe, which we can talk about. So my current project has nothing to do with Islam, at least not objectively it doesn't. There's some themes that are important. But I've written so many Islamic themed projects because I'm trying. Maybe I'm a crazy person like Don Quixote, Cervantes, who just is trying to fight this windmill that can't be defeated, right? I mean, maybe I'm that crazy person, but I've been trying for 24 years now to get some of these projects made specifically to reawaken Muslims about their history that they've forgotten. They think Muslims see themselves as inferior colonized brown people. They don't see themselves as the builders of the Taj Mahal or the Dome of the Rock. Muslims invented the guitar in Islamic Spain. They don't see themselves as the greatest musicians. We were the greatest musicians. We invented the modern music, the musical instruments that are used in the West. We invented them. They were then adopted by the West. They were Islamic. We don't even know any of that. So, and you can imagine Hollywood is less interested in promoting Muslim historical knowledge, so it's been challenging.
Awesome. So, from your responses, I get the impression that you're really a fan of a good story. How do you know when an idea is strong enough to pursue as a screenplay?
Again, this is for me it's the way I'll answer this is the quote that's on the cover of my novel Mother the Believers. I was able to get a wonderful endorsement blurb from Amy Tan, who wrote the Joy Luck Club, who's one of the best-selling authors in American literature, and she's run a lot of historical stuff, Chinese history, Chinese American history, right? And amazingly, she read my book and she gave me an endorsement, and that's the cover of my book, Amy Tan, and her endorsement of it was very simple. She called it epic and intimate. Right? That's all she had to say. And she understood the book perfectly because this was my novel in Aisha Radhiyallahu Anha, which is massive scale. It's the birth of Islam. Starts off when Aisha's a little girl and ends with her as an elderly woman when the Khilafat controls half the planet. That's how big it is, right? But it's very intimate because it's just one young woman's point of view throughout all of that, right? That's how I know things is that, all my projects have this epic nature to them because I can't say others will want to write like this. This is how I write, right? So I'm drawn to big names in history and then going into the intimacy of it. So Taj Mahal, the big names, Shah Jahan, Mumtaz Mahal, the Empress Noor Jahan, who was, when she was the Empress of India, she was more powerful than Queen Elizabeth the Great. I mean, she was she was the most powerful woman on earth. Noor Jahan ran India. Jahangir was basically checked out on opium. He was out, right? And she was running the whole empire, and she was incredible. But I said, okay, these are larger than life figures. But what interests me is looking at their humanity, of their petty jealousies, of their fears, their insecurities, their hopes, and their dreams. And so suddenly it becomes very intimate, right? Similarly, my Shadow of the Swords novel, which is based on a screenplay, wrote on Salahuddin Ayyubi, who conquered Jerusalem, or freed Jerusalem from the Crusaders. And he is a larger-than-life figure. Even by the Crusaders' accounts, he's a larger-than-life figure. They couldn't understand how such a noble, elegant, honorable man could exist, especially amongst the Muslims who they saw as barbarians. I mean, they incorrectly saw us as barbarians, but that was the propaganda they've been given. And so to me, what's interesting is to take that man and make him human and relatable. and give him flaws because he is so lionized, which is funny because his enemy was Richard the Lionheart, but he is so lionized in both Muslim literature and Crusader Christian literature. Salahuddin is a hero in Crusader literature, right? You know, that you don't see, and he really did all these incredible things. That he was the icon of chivalry. I said, well, that's also not that interesting. At some point, hearing all the wonderful things that Salahuddin did, it becomes too much because everyone has put him on such a pedestal. What's the real person? So one of the pivotal scenes in my novel is where he's finally, he's because the novel is told from everyone else's point of view, all these other characters, and Salahuddin is a major character. They're all talking about him and thinking about him, the Muslims, the Jews, the Christians. And then there's a scene near the end of the novel where Richard is about to attack Jerusalem, and Salahuddin thinks he's going to lose. He thinks he's going to lose his battle, and everything he worked on is going to be defeated. And so, in the only point in the novel where you finally get into Salahuddin's head is this moment in the novel where he goes into the Qubat al-Sakhra, the Dome of the Rock, and he talks to Allah personally in there. He just talks to Allah, does dua, talks to Allah, asking for help in his battle, and unburdens all of his fears and insecurities that he's in over his head. Everyone thinks he's this great warrior, and he's like, this is way over my head. I only got here by God's mercy, and everyone thinks I'm this invincible warrior with great honor when I'm just a guy, right? And that's the humanizing moment, right? That interests me, is looking at someone like that, how he sees himself, right? Rather than everybody else who's put him on a pedestal. So that's my storytelling. And for example, I'm working on this movie right now, a feature film about young Marilyn Monroe. It's called Goodbye, Norma Jean, and it's set in the period of her life that nobody talks about. In fact, has been erased intentionally, the period of her life before she was Marilyn Monroe, when she was just Norma Jean Dougherty. That was her married name to her first husband, Jim Dougherty, when she was a housewife here in LA, living as a housewife in the 1940s.
So before celebrity.
Before celebrity, while her husband was a sailor and he went off to World War II, and while she was working in a factory, in a munitions factory during World War II in Van Nuys, California, she got discovered by an army photographer who was taking pictures of the girls that were working on the factory line. And then she was such a lovely young woman that those photos, people wanted to photograph her. And suddenly, overnight, she became a modeling success during World War II. And then suddenly Hollywood wanted her as a star. But then Hollywood said, you have to get rid of this husband because, they wanted her on the casting couch. They didn't want a husband there to mess up their fun, right? And so she divorced him. She left him for fame, and then erased him from history. When she became Marilyn Monroe, she never talked about him again. Basically pretended that she never loved him. It was a marriage she was kind of forced into as a young girl, marriage of convenience. And that's not true at all. That's completely a lie, but it's a lie that's Hollywood. She sold to keep her movie star image, and Hollywood sold because they didn't want an image of her as Marilyn Monroe as a happy housewife making cookies for a sailor. That's not the image they were selling, right? And so I told a story of their real love that was real, that's been documented, that's been erased. And tragically, her husband Jim had to spend his whole life in the shadow of watching his love become Marilyn Monroe, and then watching her erase him publicly, saying, "I never loved this guy," just for her image. And so it's a tragic story. But because what's interesting to me is taking this epic figure of Marilyn Monroe and reducing her to herself, which is a housewife making cookies in Van Nuys, and not even believing she could be in Hollywood. It wasn't even a possibility. So she was thinking of having kids, maybe becoming a school teacher, and that was the world she had. And so how does that person become Marilyn Monroe? That's interesting to me.
Fascinating. You've worked on a number of very interesting projects. One of those projects which caught my eye was Kings. Which is basically a story, a modern day story, which is really inspired by the story of David and Goliath. Can you give us an idea as to what lessons you took whilst developing that show?
Well, I didn't develop it. I was a writer on the show. The show was created by Michael Green, who's become a very successful feature screenwriter. Like, all these Agatha Christie movies, like Murder on the Orient Express, all those movies that have come out recently. Michael's written all those movies. So he's gone on to become a very successful movie writer. But he did this TV show, and it was a TV show on NBC that was a modernized version of the telling of David. And if, people don't know the story, David was the second king of Israel. He wasn't the first. The first was a man named Saul. I think he's called Talut in the Quran, and he was the king, and then then Allah chose David to replace him, and they went to war. Essentially, David went from being the king. He killed Goliath, the enemy leader, for his king, and then his king turns against him, and then they go to war. And so that was the story of how a king basically adopts a war hero, a young war hero, to use for his own political PR, and then discovers that that war hero is being get political power, right? And then becomes a threat to him. And so, how does that relationship derail? So that was the idea of the show, but setting it in the modern day with tanks and it's not set in the old days with Goliath being killed by a slingshot. It's a tank, right? That's kind of. But what it taught me was that these stories can be adapted. The great stories that are eternal. There's a reason Shakespeare keeps being adapted in modern ways, right? Taming of the Shrew becomes like a modern romantic comedy. 10 Things I Hate About You, whatever. I mean, so you can resurrect the great stories because the journeys are archetypal, and then you can reset them in the modern day as long as you are faithful to what made the stories work in their original context.
Very fascinating. Um, you've also worked on Sleeper Cell. What was the most challenging part of writing about terrorism and faith in such a sensitive context?
Yeah, I mean, for those who don't know, Sleeper Cell was a TV show that was on Showtime in 2005, 2006, did 2 seasons. This was at the early days of the Iraq War. George W. Bush was in power. And there was a show called 24 that at the time was the biggest show on television, which had a lot of Muslim villains and comic book terrorists, whatever. And then, I didn't create the show, but these two very brilliant writers, Ethan Reef and Cyrus Vorse, created the show. They wanted to do a more realistic take on the war on terror. So this was a show about a Muslim FBI agent, African American Muslim, who infiltrates an Al Qaeda cell that the FBI discovers is working in Los Angeles, planning a terror attack. Because he's actually a Muslim, he's able to pretend to be one of them and joins them and stops their terror attack. And so, played by Michael Ealy, really brilliant actor. The most challenging part was, and look, the show actually did a very good job, despite the challenge. The challenge was, how do you make sure that you actually show Islam as we know it to be accurately, and has nothing to do with these crazy psychopaths who are doing these things, right? These terrorists. It has nothing to do with them, right? It's actually our deen is against them. Our religion began with the very rules of war that they violate. Our religion began with the rules of don't kill women, don't kill children, don't burn trees, don't poison wells, don't kill the elderly, don't kill the priests of other religions, right? Protect the churches and the synagogues. Our religion started with these rules. No other culture had these rules. Christians didn't have these rules of war. They never had these rules of war. That's why they can drop a nuclear bomb on Japan and not blink and not even think about it, right? Muslims don't think like that, right? But this idea of this extremist terrorism has been implanted as this is somehow kind of Islamist terrorism. It means it's bizarre. It means nothing because our religion was born to stop this kind of stuff. That's what our religion was born at. So how do you actively show that? And I think we did a very good job. I mean, the challenge was that, whenever you're dealing with this kind of topic, Hollywood has its red lines and its sacred cows. So, for example, if I would write scenes where the terrorists were criticizing Israel, there would be people along the process somewhere, the studio, some executive, somebody in the process would be like, I'm not comfortable with this line. I'm like, well, the bad guy's saying it. Because, that you can, not a shock, power structure of Hollywood is largely empathetic and supportive to Israel, couldn't care less about Palestine, despite what they say. I mean, they don't. And so they cared even less in 2005 and 2006, right? And so, so you'd have to face this challenge of having your stuff edited because of the political sensitivities and agendas of the Hollywood elite that didn't want certain topics being addressed.
Yeah. I remember telling you that I was introduced to you basically through this show. It was quite popular here in Australia on
Really
Foxtel.
was. I didn't know that. I'm glad
Yeah.
to know that.
Yeah. So, one of the most pivotal scenes, in my opinion, in terms of what I remember, is that scene where there is a person and he's somehow connected to these terrorists, and he basically divulges information of something that's incoming to a scholar who he's making ablution with, wudu with.
Yeah, I
And
know the scene.
that particular moment, I didn't know anything about you at that time when it was first showing, but I realized, no, 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 it has to be a Muslim who wrote this. I realized it because it was it felt as though it was coming from experience rather than anything else.
You're referring to episode 4 of the first season, which is called Scholar, which I'm very proud of. It's one of my. It's It's one of my great legacies. If I've had left any legacy, I've got these two beautiful novels. I have that episode. I've got a few things I'm proud of. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't give me anything more, then at least I got these three things, right? So that episode I'm very proud of, because it was, I was assigned to write that episode. First three episodes have been written by the gentleman who created the show. I was assigned to write episode four. I kind of lobbied for it because I was like, felt like I should write for it. But it's about a Muslim scholar based on a real person, Muslim scholar who deprograms these Al Qaeda guys, who shows them the Quran and the Sunnah and shows them what they're doing is haram, right? And has successfully deprogrammed hundreds of these people because they literally don't know what they're like. And we talked about earlier, like the brainwashing that comes from not knowing your history and not knowing your religion, right? It allows all kinds of bad ideas to come in from because a sheikh has told you you can do these things, and it's not true, right? But they don't have the information, and so this whole episode is essentially the entire episode is an action-packed episode, but it's essentially a debate between the terrorists and the sheikh about what Islam is, and I'm very very proud of that because it had to be authentically done, and that scene you're referring to is near the end of the episode where the sheikh is attempting to deprogram one of the terrorist cell members, and he thinks succeeding with him, and then that guy reveals the terror plot that they're doing, and it's in the scene in the masjid where they're doing wudu ablution to prepare for salah, and he tells him what their plan is, right? And I was very proud of that scene. It ends in a surprising way, uh, and the whole episode is filled with quotations from the Quran and Sunnah that are accurate, and I think single-handedly shattered, you know, multiple decades of propaganda about what Islam is from Hollywood. So I'm very proud. If anyone's watching this, if you haven't seen it, you can get it on Amazon, whatever. Sleeper Cell first season, especially episode four. You'll see that, and if you just watch that episode, you'll understand the whole show, and I think you'll understand what I tried to do there.
Even in the same episode, there's a scene where there is a terrorist and he's about to do something very lethal. And he looks around, he's taking a moment to realize what he's actually doing. And he looks at the cleaner who's, wearing hijab, and, there's no dialogue, and you sense a great deal just through that scene. It's a very
Yeah,
powerful scene.
thank you.
Um, Especially when, at the time there was several caricatures of Muslim characters which were prevalent. So
Yeah, and
having
those
said all,
characters came back, by the way. That show was a brief light moment because right after that, we went right back to Homeland and Tyrant and all these other shows where, those stereotypes came back. I mean, Hollywood, I remember I said Hollywood has agendas. We pushed a little too hard against those agendas, and they said we've had enough of that.
so in terms of your past projects, which do you feel was most misunderstood, and why?
Well, the most misunderstood was Mother of the Believers in the sense of the novel. I had Muslims who never read the book who sent me actual real death threats, right? Real death threats that I had to get like law enforcement to deal with, right? Because they assume that if I'm writing a novel about Sayyidina Aisha radiallahu anha and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that it must be from a haram place with false information, with intention of corrupting the deen, and they assume that because again they don't know the history, right? And you know, and then literally one person sent me this angry message. He only got as far as the opening lines of the book, which are where they quote Aisha as, telling why she's telling the novel. And she's very, this is the end of her life. She's near her death. And she's, telling the story to her nephew, the son of Zubair, right? Her brother-in-law. Her sister married Zubair, who was one of the great companions who was promised paradise, right? And he died actually in the battle, of the camel, which she led, and fighting Sayyidina Ali. So this is one of the tragedies. Sayyidina Ali and Sayyidina, Zubair were friends, and they fought against each other in this battle, and Zubair died, right? And so she's telling the story to Zubair's son, and she says some very self-deprecatory things about how she wished, looking back at her life, this is her as an old woman looking back at her life, she wished she was just like the dust of the ground or just a tree, a branch that was forgotten of a tree, really self-deprecatory. And this person got as far as that. It's the first opening page, and sent me an angry, angry, angry email, vile email attacking me as a kafir, basically. I said, where those are her exact words from the hadith. She gave at the end of her life, she was very ashamed of her involvement in the Battle of the Camel in the Civil War, the first Islamic fitna that she instigated to a large degree. and she was ashamed of it. And those were I was just quoting her words. I was quoting her words. But they didn't know the words because they don't know anything about Islam. Because again, Muslims have been deprived of their history. So he didn't know that she said that, right? I'm like, I mean, and I mean, I was quoting all the stuff from Ibn Kathir. I wasn't making any of these things up. I mean, they're right from Ibn Kathir. If you want one of the greatest, if you want to read is Quran commentary, read Ibn Kathir, right? It's incredible, and it puts so much context of what happened with the birth of Islam, and how amazing these people were and how flawed they were. It's all in Ibn Kathir, which is like ninth century, right? But that's the thing. The people that bothered to read it fell in love with it. Inspired works of art. I had Muslim women who were a Muslim woman was a painter. She sent me this beautiful, beautiful painting or a JPEG of a painting that she was inspired to draw based on one of the scenes in there, where the Sayyidina Fatima, where the Sayyidina Fatima is a major character in the book, and she was so inspired by the way I did this one scene with Sayyidina Fatima that she made a painting out of it. And that's beautiful, and it's very humbling for me. So the people, and I'll share with you one thing that really shook me. So a few days after the novel came out, I got an email through my website, whatever, from a woman who was not a Muslim who said, "Please, I need to talk to you. It's very important. I read your book. Please call me." Oh, all right. So I said, "You sure? How can I help you?" So we set up a phone call, right? And she was a woman in New York City she knew nothing about Islam, but she had picked up the novel because she liked historical fiction. Oh, books on Queen Elizabeth. Here's a book on Aisha. Let me read this, right? She read it and she said she loved the book. She read it. Took her a couple of a few days actually, just because it was literally within a week of me sending this. Took her a few days, read it. She loved it, and then put it aside. It's an interesting novel. And then she told me that the night before, when she sent me the email, she had a dream after she finished the novel. She went to sleep, she had the dream, and in the dream, the Prophet ﷺ came to her in a dream and said, "Come to Islam." And she described the dream, and it was literally like this stunning description of Medina that I hadn't even put in the novel, that she was describing things that were in Medina from the time that I knew from my research, right? And so I knew it was a real spiritual dream, and so uh, that was the humbling thing. But, I hear I'm getting death threats on one end from people that won't read the book because they're assuming I'm a kafir and I'm sent to destroy Islam. And I'm getting non-Muslims saying your prophet has come to me in a dream after reading your book. So Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. So that gave me the comfort. But it is the most misunderstood thing. And anyone who's watching this who hasn't read Mother of the Believers, I hope you will read it. Alhamdulillah, like in the biggest Muslim country, Indonesia, it was translated into Bahasa and it became a huge bestseller out there. I'm very happy with that. Like I have a massive Indonesian fan base, mashallah, and I love the Indonesian people. But the Indonesians who know Islam from the heart, right? They got it. They got the book instantly. They got it, and they've been supporting it.
Sure. You've touched on it very briefly, but I'm just wondering, have you found Hollywood to be receptive to Muslim and Middle Eastern narratives, or do you still encounter barriers?
Muslim industry, what stories or receptive to what?
Stories or ideas that you're trying to convey, which are
Oh, no,
inspired.
they don't want any of this. No, they're not receptive. They don't want any of this. They're hostile to it. Hollywood is openly hostile to it, and it's stupid because they even know this is a source of money for them. They know there's 2 billion Muslims out there. They know that Muslims are a major market. They know that Muslims actually love movies. They've always loved movies. I was reading a book called An Empire of Their Own. It's a great book. People should read it. It's a history book by a Jewish historian. It's literally subtitled How Jews Invented Hollywood. It's from a Jewish historian. And he said, looked at the history of the early Jewish founders, the movie studios, and how they brought their sort of Eastern European, New York City Jewish culture to founding Hollywood in the 1910s, 1920s, 1930s. And one of the points it makes, which is fascinating, was that in the early period of Hollywood, the Muslim world was one of the biggest buyers of Hollywood movies. Like Cairo, like you could reliably sell your Cecil B. DeMille epic in Cairo, in Palestine, in pre-Israel Palestine. Jaffa, the Jaffa movie theater was one of the biggest buyers of Hollywood movies, and it was one of the most sophisticated theaters in the Middle East, right? The Jaffa Theater, which I think was destroyed during the Nakba. But this is Muslims have always been huge consumers of this stuff, but Hollywood is at least in the last, I'd say at least since the 60s, Hollywood has become very hostile to telling Muslim stories for political reasons. Prior to the 60s, and this book that I mentioned, Empire of Their Own, actually talks about it. It says prior to the 1960s, especially during the 1930s and 40s in the early Zionist movement, Hollywood was hostile to the Zionist movement. So the movie studios would not let the Zionist organizers and fundraisers do fundraisers at the studios. They tried to. They tried to, because he said a large Jewish community in LA in the movie industry. They tried to like organize fundraisers at parties at moguls mansions or on the lot at MGM or whatever. And Louis Mayer and Jack Warner and these guys threw them out. These Jewish guys kicked them all out. Said they shut them down. Said you're going to mess up our money train. They weren't supportive. The movie moguls were not pro-Zionist. They were anti-Zionist. They said, you're going to mess up our financial thing in the Middle East by making these people our adversaries by what you're doing, right? So when those guys have all died out and the studios in the late 60s, early 70s were bought out by the corporations, and also you had the historical events of 1967 war, which created this very triumphalist feeling amongst many American Jews that didn't really exist before, this feeling of destiny that we took Jerusalem back and this was God's will, 6 days, right? So even though all these atheist Jews were like, this is divine mercy, right? And in Hollywood, all these atheist Jews, it changed their philosophy. The next generation was very pro-Israel and has remained so. And so because of that political feeling, they remain incredibly hostile to Islam for two reasons, or Islamic stories or Muslim stories, even if they're not even religious, just Arab cultural theme stories, Indonesian cultural theme stories. Like Indonesians make incredible horror movies. You're not seeing them being imported here to Hollywood. Hollywood will get stuff from Korea, right? They'll adapt Korean movies, great Korean movies. Indonesia makes the best horror movies in the world. They're scary. I can't even watch the trailers. They're so scary, right? But are you seeing Hollywood making Indonesian adaptations? They're not doing it, right? And so Turkey is selling its shows worldwide. They're number one best-selling watch shows in Latin America, Eastern Europe, right? It's Russia, Turkish shows, and Hollywood it doesn't adapt them, even though the market is there, right? So that's coming from this political agenda, and it's beginning to change now because Hollywood is financially broke in the last several years, and even though, like I said, they remain sympathetic to Israel, they are cognizant, whether they like it or not, that there's a cultural shift happening in the next generation of Western audiences that are not sympathetic to Israel, the events that are currently happening, and the smarter ones are understanding that maybe we might need to be a little bit more in the middle on this topic rather than pushing a particular point of view, which they have been doing for since the 60s, late 60s. So it's a process that's beginning to happen. I just hope I can, I'm finally, like, some of my projects that have been dead for years are beginning to get resurrected for this reason. Now there's like, you know, an awakening on their part. They haven't changed as people, but they want to ultimately, these guys want to make money. And so I just pray Allah gives me the time to actually live to see that come to fruition, because I've been doing this for 24 years and it's exhausting. And 24 years into this, first time I'm beginning to see the door opening. I've never seen it before.
So one of the things I sort of understand from you is that you really need a lot of perseverance to, push your project ahead and, stay with the project. What do you think the most important skill a screenwriter should basically cultivate within himself or herself outside of just writing, perhaps?
Well, I mean, the perseverance is the only way to survive, right? There is no other way to survive as any kind of artist, because 99.99% of the journey of most artists is failure, rejection, even if you're brilliant. The archetype is Vincent van Gogh. He was genius, the greatest artist of his generation, and died broke, unappreciated in his lifetime. 20 years after he died, 20 years after he died, his paintings became a phenomenon. 20 years later, he was a full generation ahead of the world. So that's can happen. It has happened. I know many people that are brilliant, brilliant artists, filmmakers, directors. One of my close friends is a director who's pretty much given up. Muslim director who's given up on this town after 20 years plus of trying, given up, left LA. It's a tragedy because he is brilliant. He's won some awards, just doesn't have the energy. He's got a family to take care of. He can't do it anymore. He's tired. And I understand that. I'm tired, right? But the only way to survive this is persistence, is to keep trying. And that is the only way. The broad skill of any screenwriter, Muslim or otherwise, is to not just be aware of movies. Like, the advice someone once gave, and is Frank Marshall, a very famous producer, once spoke at a university, and he was asked by these students, what classes they should be taking in film school, and he said, you shouldn't be taking film classes. You should be taking history classes. taking religion classes, philosophy classes, art history classes. You need to understand culture. You need to understand human nature because that's where storytelling comes from. You will learn the craft of filmmaking. I know I have an MFA. You do not need a film degree to learn filmmaking. You don't learn it from a film degree. You learn it from as you know, Furkan, you're a filmmaker. You only learn it from doing it. There's no other way. You can't learn it from a degree. It's a degree. The purpose of the reason I got the degree was that it opened up contacts for me because UCLA Film Schools has a lot of contacts and alumni and people and relationships. That's the purpose of it. But I didn't learn filmmaking there. I already sold scripts before I went to film school, and it was a wonderful experience at film school. But that's not what you learn there. And so the reason I think I'm good at this is because I was a religion major in college. Like Frank Marshall said, that was my major, which people were shocked with. They're like, the Muslim immigrants are like, are you crazy? You have to be an engineer. Well, it was this religion major guy. You're going to become a mullah. What are you doing with this, right? But my all of my screen like my the method that I developed that I mentioned at the beginning of my screenwriting my storytelling method that comes out of classes that comes out of a storytelling analysis we did in religion 101 in the religion intro class I did at Dartmouth College where I was an undergraduate. The intro class talked about the nature of religious storytelling. And it talked about the structure of how the Buddha's stories work, how Jesus' stories work, how the stories in Islam, the Prophet Muhammad, how the Hijrah, the story is written. And he says effective religious storytelling always goes in these kinds of terms. That's how the stories are told. That's exactly what I used to tell my screenplays. I just used a method that works in religious literature throughout history. And I only learned that from taking a religion class. So that's what you have to filmmaker, you will learn the craft of filmmaking, but you have to be a fully educated liberal arts human being. So if anyone tells you right now, especially Muslims, you know, oh brother, what is this liberal arts thing? You go get your go get your medical degree, go get your thing. That's fine if you want to go do those things. But it's if you look at the history of Islam, when Muslims were proud and the leader of the arts, their civilization dominated the planet. When Muslims began to focus on the sciences without the arts, they collapsed. They became followers. There's a reason for that, right? Because when Muslims focus on the arts, they focus on the ingenuity of the culture. The folks in the arts did all their technology. Like I said, the guitar was invented as an adaptation of the oud, and we even know where it was done in Malaga, Spain, in Islamic Spain. There was one musician who took the oud, redesigned it into the form of the modern guitar, and created the guitar, right? And so, art is the genius of a civilization. When Muslims were focused on genius, they built the Taj Mahal, right? They built the Dome of the Rock. Dome of the Rock is still standing, and I've been there, Jerusalem. It literally is awe-inspiring when you're there. It shakes you when you see it, right? And it's when Muslims stop putting art first, their science collapsed. They stopped doing new discoveries. And then they started copying Western science, which had all gotten all of its knowledge from Islamic science, which had come from its art, right? And so, Muslim mastery of geometry is what allowed them to understand, you know, astronomy. I mean, the geometry came from our need to create art. I mean, this is the mistake that modern Muslims, especially you know, misled by these fundamentalist types who are like, this is haram and movies are haram, music is haram, and this and that. And it's like they don't. This is not Islamic. It's never been based on Islam. And the people who push that, their goal, I think a lot. I believe most of these fundamentalist groups were financed by the West to keep dumb down the Muslims, and it worked.
Hmm, very interesting. So you've worked on a number of very interesting projects. What was your experience working in writers' rooms such as shows such as Tron, Twilight Zone, Roswell?
I mean, each show is different, and on TV we generally tend to work in writers' room with multiple people. Some of the best experience I had, even though the show itself was very difficult to make and didn't succeed, was the very first show I worked on was the Twilight Zone that you mentioned. It was with Forrest Whitaker. That was the example, and we did 44 30-minute episodes in one season. It was insane. It was an anthology. Every episode was new cast, new this, and we had to make it work. And my boss on there was Ira Steven Behr, the showrunner. Ira Behr was the creator of Deep Space Nine, if you're a Star Trek fan. So it's probably, in my opinion, the most sophisticated of Star Treks, the best of the Star Treks, in my opinion, was Deep Space Nine after the original series. And Ira Behr taught me everything I needed to know about how to be a showrunner because he was so brilliant. Mashallah. He's still with us, and I would love to work with him again someday, or at least just to thank him for what he taught me, because I would then work on many other shows, and I'll let you guess which ones they were that had writers' room with people that were less experienced, who didn't have his, because he was working from the 80s. I mean, he was this old guy at school who'd been trained in the '80s as a writer on '80s television, and so he knew how writers' room works, and he knew how to to and really incentivize writers and make them feel like a team and make them feel like this was their show and not the showrunner's show, that they were just employees. And I've worked on shows where the disastrous ones I've worked on is the opposite, where the showrunners, you are my servants, you're my slaves, here to implement my vision. It creates a bad feeling and it creates bad work, and and so ultimately, the best shows I've worked on is where there's collegial respect, and they've been actually relatively few of the shows I've worked on have had that, and so that's the challenge.
Was there a particular project which transformed the way that you think about storytelling? I'm not sure if it was this one that you just referenced or not.
Well, it was Twilight Zone taught me how to run a show. I mean, I was at the bottom of the barrel, I was a staff writer, right? But watching Ira Bear, I learned everything of how a showrunner works, right? So to bring it to when I was running the Tron animated series, which on Disney Plus you can get it now, you can watch, and I think Disney XD still exists. I don't know if it's in Australia, but it was originally a Disney XD channel project, Tron Uprising, and now it's on Disney Plus, the streamer. And I was the head writer for that, and I tried to run it the way Ira ran the show, and I'm very proud of how I ran that show. And because I felt like we created a really collegial environment that produced incredible scripts. I think you've seen some of the show. I'm very proud of what we did. Um, and that was all Ira's training. So that's where I learned how to be a showrunner and a head writer. Writing, I just learned on my own by the methods that I've described to you.
That's stating. One thing I'm very curious about is how do you approach collaboration with directors, producers, other writers, but still maintain your own voice?
Well, it depends on the context, right? If you're working in television, the writers are the dominant force in television and directors work for them. So, because, the writers are the consistent people that are there every week, the directors episodically cycle out. There's a new director for every episode. So the writers are the consistent voice in their division and the director is there to implement it. So you have a lot of power. Movies, it's the other way around. In movies, generally the script is taken from the writer, and unless he's very famous and powerful and has earned the trust of the director from previous work, they're usually pushed off the project. And that's happened to me, multiple times on movie projects that didn't get made. And probably because they didn't get made was because the directors that were hired to do the projects would come in, they would then marginalize me, fine. What can I do? And then they would usually rewrite the script themselves, and most directors can't write. It's actually a very unique skill. They're different skills. Directing and writing are very different skills. That's why most writers aren't good directors. Most directors are not good writers. But then their ego requires them to believe they're good writers, and so then they usually rewrite my scripts and ruin them. And in each single instance where that happened, the producers would call me and said, "Hey, can you fix what the director did to the script?" I said, "I don't need to fix anything. Why don't you just go back to the first version that you all loved?" Right? It's like, "Oh, we can't do that because we have to politically make him feel like it's his script." I was like, "But I can't fix it. To fix it means just get rid of his garbage and go back to the other version, which you can film." Right? His rewrite was not necessary. Like, yes, we know that, but we can't do that because then it'll upset him that we didn't use his brilliant ideas. And I was like, well, I can't fix it. And each time I refuse to do it, which is probably not the advice I would give to other people. But but these were projects that were very close to me, and I didn't like what was done to these projects. And I said, director can fix it. You don't need me, right? You told me you don't need me. So good luck to you, right? And each time the project died because the director couldn't fix it, right? And so that's the challenge of that you face with that. I mean, I'm probably one of the reasons that I haven't got a lot of movies made yet is that I'm more comfortable in the position of authority. I don't like it when directors who don't know what they're doing in story. Story is very sacred to me. Like I said, came out of study of religion. Story is very sacred to me. So a director comes and messes up my script. I take it very personally. I probably shouldn't. That's probably not the professional, the mature way to handle it. But I take it very personally. And I'm like, if you would have the audacity to ruin something out of your ego that was good, it's your problem. It's not my problem. And again, I'm not advising anyone to do that. I'm just saying that's one of the reasons probably why, I'm still not 24 years into this, a well-known movie writer, although inshallah, that will change. For me, my goal is to become a writer director, because that's where I can then implement my vision in feature films. I don't think I'm meant to be a feature writer for other directors. I don't have.
Fair enough. You've referenced this Norma Jean story or
Mhm.
this
Yes,
Norma Jean project. Are there any other stories or projects you still hope to tell that you have not been able to bring to the screen yet?
all of them, all of them. from my Taj Mahal script. They've all sold and then got trapped in the system. My Taj Mahal script sold to Warner Brothers 23 years ago in 2003. So it's 22 years ago. Hasn't been made yet, right? People's literally major producer company every year said this is the best script I've ever read. This is Oscar level script. And then they never pull it off because I believe inshallah it's mine. I'm supposed to direct it. So well, you have to get to. I was like 24 years old. Like I still have to become a major feature director to pull it off, whatever. But we'll get there, inshallah. But then I mentioned my Islamic Spain El Andalus show that I sold that to Universal. We briefly had top directors like Ang Lee, Sam Raimi, and others read the script, loved it, and for a variety of reasons, each of them left the project. So the project stalled. And I have a project that I've been developing for several years at the Stars Network about the Ottoman Empire, which unfortunately has stalled. Well, I mean, I have a Scheherazade project, which inshallah might come back. There's some energy around it. And so, everything I've done has been delayed. My manager, I've been with the same manager, alhamdulillah, since 2004. So you can imagine 21 years. This woman's incredible. She's been with me and supported me through all this. She has a nickname for me. Her nickname for me is Boomerang. It's boomerang because she's witnessed all of my projects die, and then they throw the boomerang, it disappears into the fog, and then years later, usually 5 to 10 years later, it comes back and comes alive. And that's what it is that I have a little bit of, inshallah, not the full curse, but a little bit of the Van Gogh curse in that I'm ahead of this town. I sold Taj Mahal 15 years before, or 15 years before Slumdog Millionaire and The Life of Pi. And when I sold it in 2003, owners brought it and then panicked and said, well, no one's going to watch a movie with a bunch of Indian people in Hollywood, right? And it took 15 more years for two back-to-back Oscar-winning movies, Slumdog Millionaire and Life of Pi, with unknown Indian casts, right? It took it, and they both won the Oscar and were commercially successful. But I was 15 years ahead of that trend. I could just see it coming. So that's been the challenge. When you're ahead of the trend, no one, everyone thinks you're crazy. So and then it's just another dead project. By the time society catches up, it takes energy to resurrect it.
Sure. Look, I'm very hesitant to keep you longer than I
Yeah, I
should,
have to.
even though,
I got to get. As you can see from the darkness, it was light when we
yeah.
started. Dark now. I got to get ready for dinner. So yeah,
So I'll just end with this one last question. I like to end
yes,
with a happy,
please.
lighthearted question. Do you have any guilty pleasure TV shows or movies that you love but would surprise the people who are basically
Well,
listening or watching?
I'm just trying to see what's a guilty pleasure. I mean, I don't know if it's a guilty pleasure, but I enjoy Wednesday. I think Wednesday is a really, really fun show. I don't know if you guys are watching in Australia, but I love that show. And I'm having the time of my life watching that show. I watch a lot of stupid Discovery Channel things like you know Expedition X, Bigfoot kind of things, right? UFO kind of thing. I love that kind of stuff, right? I love all
The
these
History Channel? Are you talking about?
well, yeah, well, or it's on the Discovery, thing, but it's on History Channels, and the ancient aliens. I love ancient aliens. I love all that stuff, right? So that's my kind of thing. I love all those paranormal documentary type shows, ghost hunters and things like that. That's the stuff that people get startled by. I like watching Naked and Afraid, but only when there's good looking people. They're usually ugly people, and see who wants to see them naked, right?
Okay, so if
That's
there
my
was, if you were trapped on a desert island, let's say, I'm sorry, it's a cliche, and you only had three films to watch forever, which ones would you choose?
I would choose The Ten Commandments by Cecil B. DeMille, the Charlton Heston. That was the first movie I ever saw, and it put me on my spiritual path because I'll tell you, I watched it as a child when it came on TV. I just immigrated from Pakistan, just learned to speak English from watching cartoons, and it comes on every April and Passover in America on the ABC channel every year, and I watched it in our little TV in New York in our little one bedroom apartment that we had when we immigrated. I must have been 4 or 5 years old, and I was so blown away by the epic of that movie and by this whole thing. I never thought about the spirituality. I was 4 or 5 years old as Moses, right? And I was talking to God and I turned to my father, and I remember this vividly. I turned to my father and I asked him after the movie was over because my heart was racing, like the Red Sea splitting open and God speaking through the pillar of fire, and it was just, my heart was racing. And I asked my father, what is God? And he's a 5 year old, he's a child. At some point, every child always asks that, right? That was my moment when I asked it. And my father, mashallah, gave me the most incredible answer to this day, which is the best answer I've ever had anyone say. He took me on his lap and he said to me, God is the light of the universe, according to the Quran. God is the light of the universe. Musa alayhi salam, Moses just saw one ray of it. And so that's something that put me on my spiritual path, my epic path. Two other films, I would I would actually put up there. I think I this might surprise people. I would put Gone with the Wind, which is the classic Gone with the Wind with Vivian Leigh,
That is
Clark
surprising.
Gable. I'm a fan of I think the book is one of the greatest novels ever written. As a novelist, it humbles me. The book is greater than the movie, and the movie is incredible. And I think it's visually stunning movie, incredible performances, and again, an unlikely heroine. You know, a angry, jealous, selfish Southern woman who owned slaves is the heroine of the movie, right? And so, and that's for interests me again, because the broad, bigger, epic thing is the Civil War and the destruction of an entire culture, which many would argue was a culture that needed to be destroyed, the slave culture of the South, but it was a culture, and how one woman intimately survives that, what in the process of losing her soul to survive, right? That to me is very interesting. And the third one I think that I would actually put is also surprising. I would put Peter Jackson's King Kong. Peter Jackson's
I can see that one.
because
Gone with the Wind is surprising though.
people should watch it again. Read the book. The book's incredible. Book is better. But yeah, Peter Jackson is my favorite director. People always ask favorite director. People always default to Steven Spielberg. It's just a default answer without thinking, right? If you actually think about it, Peter Jackson is my favorite director because he does these incredibly epic and intimate things. Lord of the Rings is very epic and intimate, and that's also true. King Kong, you can feel the love he has because King Kong was the movie that he saw as a child and wanted, like I saw Ten Commandments, that put me on my path. He saw King Kong on TV, in New Zealand and as a child, and that's what put him on his path. So he threw his heart into making that movie because he was honoring his childhood vision, right? And the love for filmmaking and the love for the original King Kong is incredible. And Naomi Watts is just perfect in that film. She's just perfect as as his character. And so for me, if I had only three movies, I could watch those again and again and learn something new about filmmaking each time.
All right, awesome. Thank you, Kamran Pasha, for your time. I can hear the dishes in the background. I know
I'm taking
it
care of
sounds like
stuff.
dinner is coming very soon. So thank you once again for your time. I really appreciate it. It was very interesting. And have an excellent dinner, I suppose. What else can I
Thank you
say?
much. And I just want to say, anyone who's watching this, especially if you're Muslim and you have dreams of becoming a filmmaker, and everyone's telling you it can't be done and go become a doctor, they're right. Go become a doctor if you want money and stability and a safe life, right? This is not a safe life, but it's not a life I would trade. I'm 24 years into this. I'm still not economically stable. I still don't know what my life is gonna be like in 1 month, less than 3 months or 6 months. I mean, for 1 month away. So, but this is what Allah chose me to do. And, I hope I succeed before I die. But if I die with just having made those three things that we mentioned, then it was a good life. And it was a life that I'm grateful for. So if you're willing to give up safety and security to be able to say that, then alhamdulillah, try this.
Thank you once again.
Thank you. I'll talk to you soon. Assalamu alaikum.